Hello, everyone, and welcome to MintCast, the official podcast of MintPress News. I am your host, Mnar Adley, and I'm the founder and director of MintPress News. It seems that the United States is ready for yet another war, another confrontation. It's trying to start a war now with Venezuela. The Trump administration has sent a fleet of warships alongside thousands of soldiers to the Caribbean, even blowing up a Venezuelan ship it claimed was involved in the drug trade. But Washington has had its eyes on regime change in Venezuela for decades, sponsoring coups, opposition movements, and military operations against the socialist government. So how close are we to yet another forever war? It's almost like we can't keep up from the current war that the United States is backing with Israel and its genocide and its occupation and its agitation of other countries, including the latest bombing in Qatar, Lebanon, Tunisia with the Samud flotillas. It is just ongoing, and it feels like we can't keep up. But we will be dismantling some of the propaganda when it comes to this crisis, this buildup for an invasion of Venezuela. I am joined by three people today to discuss this issue. Joining from Caracas is Diego Sequera. He is a journalist, a writer, and with the local media outlet Misión Verdad. Also joining me is Leonardo Flores. He is the co-founder of the Venezuela Solidarity Network and a former analyst with the Venezuelan Embassy in Washington, D.C. And finally, we have the brilliant MacLeod, who's also here. He is our senior staff writer and lead investigative journalist at MintPress News. And, he has completed his PhD on the topic of Venezuelan politics and wrote the book, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting. Make sure to order his book and check that out. I feel so humbled to be here with all of you gentlemen. You guys are definitely, this is like the all-star team to talk about what's happening in Venezuela. And of course, I wish it was under better circumstances. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on MintPress, and I hope viewers continue to support the great journalism that you all are doing.
Really appreciate that. And before we get on into the show, I do have a special announcement to make. If you've been following MintPress News, you might have noticed that we launched a recent campaign on Indiegogo. MintPress News is facing an existential threat after 14 years of providing fearless, independent, investigative journalism that holds the military-industrial complex accountable. We are actually now at risk of shutting down. One of our main lines of funding has been cut, and so we need every single person who's watching us today to go on Indiegogo and support our campaign. If you've been following us for the 14 years, even just from the couple of years, you might already know that we were banned from PayPal, algorithmically blacklisted from Google, from their Project Owl. We've been algorithmically shadow banned on Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. We were banned actually from TikTok. And it's all because of our reporting that names the names. And so we are asking you, our viewers and readers, the lifeblood of our independent organization, to support MintPress News as we continue to challenge and scrutinize empire, imperialism, and the military-industrial complex. It is because of independent journalism that people are becoming more aware in the United States about the United States' addiction to war. So your support means everything to us to help us keep on going. Join us on Indiegogo. So let's turn back to what we were planning on talking to, which is Venezuela right now. It's completely disturbing what the United States is doing, having its warships encircling the country. The Trump administration has placed a $50 million bounty on President Maduro's head. So, Diego, I want to start with you as someone who is Venezuelan, who is there as a journalist. What is the sentiment right now inside of Venezuela with the United States having its warheads pointed directly at your country? What is the situation on the ground right now?
Thank you, Mnar. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, you're well aware that you got my full support given the new challenges a new round of challenges for you. I'm sure you're going to overcome. Regarding the situation here, well, Venezuela has gone through so much that the first noise, I guess, it's not so paralyzing or shocking. People are about their own business. I'm in a very bustling area of Caracas, which it could be a good benchmark to measure how Caracas, at least, it's behaving these days, and it kind of gives the impression that basically nothing is happening or will happen. But of course, this has to do with, like I said, it has a lot to do with this is not the first time, not even the first time of threats of military action, and besides the point, I mean, until something really happens, I think we're not going to see the actual reaction of people. But beyond that point, I mean, on a more medium political level, you can see also that our president has called for enlisting in the national militia, which is a component of our armed forces, a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of people basically joined and signed up. Huge numbers, they said. They talk about even 8 million. Make that whatever you want about it. I'm sure that it's a lot of people anyways. And this also goes beyond the sphere of Chavismo itself. I don't know how aware the U.S. is, probably not. I mean, this is also usually based on flawed analysis that set up the strategy, and usually brings a lot of blunders with them that also at some point becomes blowback. I don't know how sure they are, how aware they are of let's call it the nationalist vein, the Bolivarian vein, that not necessarily means that a Venezuelan citizen necessarily supports the government, supports Chavismo. But and even looking for change, for political change, but one thing is to have those ideas, and another one is to be threatened directly by the U.S. for regime change in this case, because of course you can clearly see through the accusations of the Cartel de los Flores and whatnot. We can talk about that further on. But you can't stop this and think that people beyond that phrase not going to react or oppose. There are already even opposition politicians that already said that in any given situation of this sort, a hypothetical attack, our president, it's Nicolás Maduro, and this is our country, we're going to defend it. Of course, there's also a fringe spectrum here of people who are, some, you can say, wishful thinking, and then you have, from the extremist factions of the opposition, you have people who are actually craving for this, because this would do their work, as in finding what they call an easiest direct way of regime change, which is not. That's part of this flawed analysis we've been talking about. So right now, I mean, like I said, you don't get the feeling properly unless you check out the news, unless you are following what the recent statement and where the footage we've seen from southern Puerto Rico or what the president, the vice president, Marco Rubio, everyone has been saying about Venezuela. So one has to be cautious, and we don't expect the best of the situation right now, but there's no fear on the street, which is like the main headline I would choose to sum up the situation here right now.
We're talking about a country who is led by a revolutionary vision by Hugo Chavez, a workers' revolution. And he famously called the United States the Great Satan, and for good reason. I mean, Venezuela has been the target of U.S. imperialist sabotage against this country for decades, and including coups. And when I visited Venezuela a few years ago, Diego, you were one of the people that hosted me there. I mean, I was there as an independent election observer, and I met with people and I walked through the streets, and it was just so beautiful to see just how much support people had for the revolution that Nicolás Maduro was carrying on. And it was obvious that Venezuela is a country that represents resistance to U.S. imperialism. And it does not surprise me that every single attempt that the U.S. has made to overthrow the government in Venezuela has failed. They've failed, every single one of them, because the people there, the majority of the people stand with the revolution, and they stand with Hugo Chavez and they stand with Nicolás Maduro. So it would not surprise me that 8 million people joined this force to defend their country from U.S. sabotage. And so, Leonardo, I think it's really important that we break down and dismantle these narco trafficking accusations that are being put on Nicolás Maduro himself. So what do you make of these allegations about Maduro and about Venezuela being a drug-producing hotspot?
Yeah, I mean, all the evidence runs counter to that claim, right? That Venezuela somehow is a drug-producing hotspot. In fact, when we look at the numbers, and these are numbers that the DEA agrees with, it's that Venezuela produces zero cocaine. It does not grow coca leaf. It does not, at most, 5% of the cocaine produced in South America flows out of Venezuela as a transit country. So the bulk of the cocaine, rather than flowing out of the Caribbean, flows through the Pacific. We're talking 87%. 70%, and this is a figure that just came out pretty recently, that they estimate that 70% of the cocaine in the world flows actually out of Ecuador, which has a Pacific coastline. So this idea that somehow the United States is sending its warships to the Caribbean, to the Venezuelan coast, or right outside on international waters, to protect American citizens from drugs, it's ludicrous. Because if you wanted to do that, first of all, you wouldn't use the military for that. We know from 50 years almost of the war on drugs, a war that has completely failed, that militarizing this war, or militarizing this problem rather, is not a solution. Secondly, the cocaine is hardly the big problem in the United States right now when we're talking about drug use and overdoses, and when we see people on the streets of our cities that are suffering from addiction. It's opioids, it's fentanyl, it's heroin, it's other things that, not cocaine, right? Cocaine was a big problem back in the 80s, early 90s. Now, not as much. It's other drugs that Venezuela doesn't produce at all. Fentanyl, there's no fentanyl in Venezuela that goes to the United States. So this is a myth that really we have to take down and we have to debunk, right? And then when we talk about these narco-terrorism charges, I mean, this is absurd, right? I mean, I challenge anyone to name one terrorist act that the Bolivarian government has carried out in the past 27 years since it was first elected. There's none. The drug charges themselves, they focus on the Tren de Aragua, they focus on the Cartel de los Soles. But then their own reports really undercut their arguments. When I say their own reports, I'm talking about the United States intelligence services and other agencies. So for example, there was this memo that was leaked in, believe it was May, from the National Intelligence Council. And here I'm going to read a quote where it says, the Maduro regime probably does not have a policy of cooperating with TDA's Tren de Aragua, and is not directing TDA movement and operations in the United States. Venezuelan intelligence, military, and police services view TDA as a security threat and operate against it in ways that make it highly unlikely the two sides would cooperate in a strategic or consistent way. So right away, this is the top levels of US intelligence acknowledging that TDA not only doesn't work with Venezuela, but that Venezuela views it as a threat. And in fact, the TDA was functionally destroyed by the Venezuelan security forces in 2022, 2023. And now what we have are remnants of the TDA throughout the hemisphere that kind of act as a loose network, or that trade on this TDA name to kind of further their criminal enterprises. On top of that, let me just read a quick quote from the DEA's National Drug Threat Assessment. This is a yearly report that the DEA issues. And in the 2025 report, they say TDA members also conduct small-scale drug trafficking activities. So in this DEA report, the only mentions of Venezuela are in these two paragraphs about TDA, where they don't even say that it's a cartel, and they don't go into narco-terrorism. They say mostly that the TDA engages in human trafficking and smuggling, and really using migrants to their own ends, and does very little drug trafficking. So it undercuts the Trump administration's argument about narco-terrorism completely. Furthermore, and I'll just add, in terms of the Cartel de los Soles, I was looking back through these drug assessment reports for the past 15 years. Some of them aren't publicly available, but in the ones that were, and I looked at around a dozen or so, the Cartel de los Soles, do you know how many times it's mentioned? 0 times. 0 mentions at all over the past 15 years. So clearly, this is not a cartel that, first of all, it's a cartel that doesn't exist. Secondly, it's not any sort of threat to the United States. So what we're seeing is kind of the political maneuvering by Marco Rubio and other hardliners that really are more interested in Cuba than Venezuela, using this kind of rhetoric of crime and narco-terrorism to push the United States into a conflict with Venezuela.
Absolutely. And I think if the United States cared about the war on drugs, we wouldn't have had our U.S. military members, our soldiers, defending those poppy plants in Afghanistan. And I want to point out that Marco Rubio's pronouncements about being tough on drugs, they really fall flat when we remember his own brother-in-law, Orlando Cecilia, was a cocaine drug lord who spent over 12 years in a Florida prison. So, it's obvious that Washington has always wanted to gain back control over Venezuela's oil and Venezuela's incredible mineral wealth. Of course, we know that this includes the largest proven oil reserves in the world, but also significant deposits of iron, natural gas, gold, and diamonds, and other minerals that are used for military equipment. And so, Alan, there is obviously a huge undertone to all of this, which is that the U.S.'s history of trying to provoke regime change in Venezuela. Could you first tell us what Marco Rubio has said about Venezuela, and then kind of give us a history of the United States provoking regime change?
Yeah, sure. So Marco Rubio is a Cuban-American Secretary of State, and he has really been a hardliner on Venezuela for his entire career, like so many Cuban-Americans have. We know what Rubio was doing in the first Trump administration from books like Mark Esper's tell-all books that came out. Mark Esper was the defense secretary under Trump. You can also read National Security Advisor John Bolton's book, The Room Where It Happens. And basically what came out of it was that Rubio was one of the super hawks in the cabinet, really pushing for regime change, even pushing for a potential military invasion of Venezuela. We might remember in 2020, the United States tried to launch a series of coups, trying to push Juan Guaido into the Miraflores presidential palace. During that time, Rubio was really one of the strongest supporters of that, and he was probably the brains behind it. You might even remember him tweeting pictures of Gaddafi being lynched and sodomized to Nicolás Maduro at the time. So he was putting that out in a public forum, snuff pictures, basically, trying to intimidate a government and a foreign official in that way. So Rubio, yeah, he's, one of these, the real hardliners. I did call him a mastermind, but, frankly, it's clear that he doesn't really understand a lot about Venezuela. There was one time when I remember he was on social media talking about how the socialist government is falling, and a reason for this is because the Germán Dam in Venezuela had been destroyed. But he'd completely misunderstood the article, and actually the journalist who wrote it came in and said, actually, that's not at all what happened. My name is Germán Dam. You've completely misunderstood what's going on here. And yeah, I mean, he's a ridiculous figure in so many ways. But he is pretty typical for the US, whether it's Democrat or Republican in the administration. Before 1998 and the election of Hugo Chavez, Venezuela was actually one of the US's key allies in the region, and it was doing whatever it was told. Basically, it would pump oil whenever the United States told it to keep the prices nice and low. But all of that changed when Chavez was elected, and pretty quickly he realized that the minerals wealth of Venezuela really had to be directed towards benefiting the people of Venezuela. And that put him right in the crosshairs of the United States. And so really, I have to say, for the last quarter of a century, there hasn't been a day when the United States hasn't been trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. We saw them greenlight a coup in 2002 where the US ambassador, I think his name was Charles Shapiro, was actually at the headquarters of the coup. The NED and USAID, these shadowy government organizations that funnel money to political organizations all over the world, have very deep footprints in Venezuela, sponsoring so many opposition groups, whether that's political, social, economic, NGOs, everything. They've been sponsoring, the Venezuelan opposition for many decades now. The US refused to recognize the 2013 elections, which saw Maduro come to power. They were the only country in the world, actually, that refused to recognize these elections. So the US stood in splendid isolation. And then, as we were talking about earlier, under the Obama administration, since March 2015, the United States has formally been under a state of emergency, supposedly because of the extraordinary threat Venezuela poses to the United States. And what these sanctions, which should really be called a blockade or unilateral coercive measures, mean is that they've basically been trying to destroy the Venezuelan economy. And even though they haven't been able to overthrow the government, they have had significant success in making the people of Venezuela suffer. But that was really turned up to 11 when Trump was elected in 2016. Trump, as we know, supported Juan Guaido. He greenlit the ridiculous Operation Gideon, often called the Bay of Piglets, where former US Green Berets led a group of mostly Colombian mercenaries to try to shoot their way into the presidential palace and install Juan Guaido as a dictator. They supported this ridiculous parallel government, and they've also been engaging in incredible acts of international piracy, trying to take Venezuelan vessels from open seas and seize the cargo there. The Bank of England famously seized nearly $2 billion worth of Venezuelan gold and basically transferred it to the parallel government led by Guaido. So there is this very long history going back almost from day one in Venezuela of the United States trying to overthrow the country. And that's the critical backdrop which pretty much none of the corporate media outlets that you read about Venezuela ever fill you in on. And so the public are just generally none the wiser on what's actually happening in the country.
Absolutely. I mean, the media specializes in not providing any sort of historical context to U.S. sabotage of other countries so that they can continue to manufacture consent for these regime change wars. But it seems like the people in Venezuela are not backing down. They're uniting more than ever. Diego, we talked a little bit about this militia that's being formed of nearly 8 million people, just a really incredible number, but it really shouldn't surprise people. We have a country that is dedicated to defending their country. I mean, if you think about it, if we had a threat here in the United States where a foreign government or foreign military was about to invade here, we would have a, military that would organize, and we'd have probably citizens join the military to support and defend their country. So it's not at all surprising that that number is at 8 million right now. Could you tell us more about these militias, Diego, and what their role is and how seriously Venezuela is taking this threat of a U.S. invasion?
Well, militia has been a component of the armed forces ever since the Comandantes years, since Chavez. It was formed, I'm not sure, maybe Leonardo can help me with this one, but I think it was around 2011 or 12, or even before, but during the early decade. And as another component of the armed forces, that was during those years, and it had also, a territorial role, and sometimes they have secondary roles in many aspects, in security aspects, or organizing and social engagement ever since. It's not as kinetic, let's call it that way, as other components, of course, of the armed forces, but it has been there ever since. So, and the rationale behind it is quite clear, and also it has been clearly stated also by our president recently. I mean, he said, if something gets to happen, we're going to have a republic in arms, which of course this has to do also with an asymmetric approach to the threats that we're dealing with regarding the U.S. and regarding also, because you can't dealing one from the other, of the internal threats. Since the last election, the presidential elections last year on July 28th on, our interior minister, Diosdado Cabello, told couple of weeks ago in one of those press conferences, showing one of the recent one of these terrorist plots that was foiled, which involves, by the way, Albanian narco clans who operate from Ecuador, U.S. mercenaries and from other places, and extremist factions of the Venezuelan opposition, which you have to think about that, especially now when they're trying to mix one thing with the other, as in, what about if there was some sort of upheaval, some sort of turmoil going on inside Venezuela when all this flotilla, all this task force arrived into near our shores? It kind of, it's something that's not, that has happened before. It happened in 2015, 2016 with a criminal insurgency that was brewing during those days. Right after that, it came that we had one of the most violent, unconventional warfare / color-coded revolution attempt back in that year. So timing and pacing, I think it's essential here. So that also explains the role of people who are actually ingrained in their own communities, in their own territories, who knows everyone, who knows also the land and the security demands it has in order to make an even more comprehensive and thorough approach to security in all levels. That's basically the rationale behind it. Of course, it also has the classic elements such as, popular prolonged warfare, like Maoist style, and that kind of documentation, let's call it that way, that kind of doctrine. But it has been ingrained in the national defense doctrine ever since. And yeah, I think that it's important they also have, to some extent, also have intelligence roles, and they have social intelligence role. I mean, they're not part of the security system itself, but there are always people who are, inteligencia social, they call it, social intelligence. People knowing what's weird, what's going on around their own surroundings, and being able to report and to seriously, this is important, assess what the nature of those threats that we're talking about, because that's also part of the equation, let's call it that way. So that's basically its role ever since. And so now what we've seen is just a big mobilization towards raising the numbers even higher. And I might add this also, I think it has also a psychological effect, a deterrent effect, I might add. And I think this also plays out in how the psychological sphere of this moment plays out. If there wasn't this kind of response the last couple of weeks, probably the U.S. assessment regarding how easy, how slam dunky-ish was to intimidate, to find some breaking point inside Venezuela would have been more obvious, and it isn't because of this, I think.
Well, I think a lot of people. Oh, go ahead.
I would just add in, among other aspects, of course, but that's an essential one. That was what I was saying.
Okay, and I appreciate you explaining that. I think a lot of people are curious, why now? Why is Trump doing this right now? Like, what is it about this moment? And so, Leonardo, I'm curious to know, what is your assessment on the situation, and why do you think Trump is trying to invade Venezuela right now? And do you think that they will actually follow through?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because right now there's a very clear divide within the Trump administration. On the one hand, you have this kind of faction of MAGA isolationist types who don't want to necessarily see a conflict in Venezuela. And that faction is right now spearheaded by Richard Grenell, who, among other things, is Trump's special envoy for Venezuela. And it was thanks to this faction that the United States and Venezuela came to an agreement pretty recently, about a little bit over a month ago, to not only give Chevron a new oil license, but to free the 256 Venezuelans who were held hostage in the Salvadoran torture prison Sequera, and to reunite some Venezuelan children with their families. So the other side of the coin, though, is the Marco Rubio faction, the neocons, who really have had their eyes set on Venezuela for decades, as Alan was saying. And they have been pushed. They were pushing against the Chevron license from the beginning. In fact, at one point, Trump called the congresspeople from South Florida crazy Cubans because they were threatening to derail his big, beautiful bill if Trump gave Chevron a license. So he didn't give them a license until after the bill had passed. But instead of denying the license, what he did was allow this military deployment to the Caribbean. So that's one of the reasons why now. It's because there's this infighting within the Trump administration. Another big reason is, we're seeing Trump use the rhetoric of crime, not just against Venezuela, but internally in the United States. He's not only deployed National Guard and ICE throughout Washington, D.C., but he's threatening to do it in Chicago, Baltimore, New Orleans, many other cities. That goes along with what we're seeing in Venezuela. And part of it, and I think, I live in Washington, D.C., and I was at a rally last week against this occupation of Washington, D.C., and I saw dozens and dozens of signs linking the occupation of D.C. to the Epstein case, right? So I think that plays a role as well in trying to change the topic of conversation from Epstein to crime and to Venezuela and to anything else that could stick. I don't know that an invasion is imminent. To invade Venezuela, they're definitely going to need more than the 5,000 Marines that are on board these ships and more than the Marines that are training in Puerto Rico. They're really going to need help from Colombia and Brazil and from the regional bases they have all around. Right now, those conditions don't exist. But that's not to say that there is no danger, right? The danger is that the Trump administration is going to start bombing inside Venezuela, as they just said that they've been discussing over the past week. And then at that point, we would see Venezuela respond and something could escalate and go out of control. To me, the reason, or at least one of the big reasons that they deployed the fleet was to cause kind of a psychological break within the Venezuelan people and more specifically within the Venezuelan armed forces. Because when we saw these ships first arrive, if you looked at social media in Venezuela, they were saying things like, "Oh, now is the time for the people in the armed forces to rise up against Maduro." And they do this pretty regularly, but you see the traffic spike when the U.S. is planning something. So they're trying to get all these generals to flip, and it didn't happen. They're trying to get the Venezuelan people to really rise up against their government, and it didn't happen. Instead, the opposite has happened, right? We've seen the armed forces in Venezuela become more cohesive. And as Diego mentioned, we've seen, the people take more significant role in the defense of the nation through the militias.
Alan, what do you think of Leonardo's assessment?
Yeah, I think he's pretty much on point. Ultimately, if they've only got 4,500 servicemen, as what has been reported in the media, that's simply not enough to stage some sort of large-scale invasion of a country that is, much larger than, it's not some little place that you can take over. In fact, 4,500 troops might not even be enough to subdue Chicago. Who knows? My sense is probably that this is an operation to try to put pressure on Venezuela and see what happens. Put pressure on the structure. Will cracks emerge? Will generals, for example, try to defect? Will there be mass panic? The United States, of course, has spent decades trying to penetrate the Venezuelan armed forces, particularly the officer corps, and try to peel off people there, try to find allies within the movement that could potentially do its dirty work for it. But yeah, it's not clear that that's actually going to happen. And it's also clear that this is obviously not about drugs, as Leonardo has made clear as well. I don't think it was the last time. I think 2 times ago when I was in Venezuela, I spoke to someone in the government, William Castillo. And normally we talk about the Republicans and the Democrats as being 2 sides of the same coin. They're basically the same one-party state. But he said for Venezuelans, there is actually a bit of a difference. And generally, the Democrats don't favor the sort of invasion of Venezuela. They prefer the sort of sanctions and the NGO way of trying to change the society. But people like Trump and the people he surrounded himself are real hardliners. In Trump's first administration, he reportedly said that it would be, quote, cool to invade Venezuela because, quote, it's really part of the United States, end quote. So that's the sort of mentality Trump has, go in, bash him on the head, take the oil. Who knows what's going to happen when tensions rise? There could be misgivings, there could be misunderstandings, and something terrible could happen. But I would say that if the United States does try to engineer a regime change operation in Venezuela, and it is successful, I would predict that we would see a massive spike in drug production in Venezuela. Because if you look at what happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the United States wanted to overthrow a leftist government in Afghanistan. They did it by funding ultra-reactionary conservative Islamists like Osama bin Laden, and they allowed the Mujahideen to control the opium trade, making Afghanistan the world center for opium production. In Nicaragua in the 80s, the United States tried to overthrow the leftist government there, and they sponsored the Contras, who were deeply involved in the cocaine trade, flooding the United States with cocaine. In Bolivia, the government in the 2000s kicked out the Drug Enforcement Agency, and cocaine production dropped off a cliff there. So when we see the United States getting more involved in the so-called war against drugs, time after time we see drug production actually going up. So that would be my prediction. Apart from that, I don't want to place any bets on what Trump is actually thinking, but I think Leonardo hit the nail on the head.
Absolutely. And, just listening to everybody and just, because of us press reporting on this issue for such a long time, and myself and Alan having visited Venezuela, a lot of the destabilization efforts that the United States has put on Venezuela seem to be coming from the same playbook, borrowed from other countries the United States has tried to destabilize and overthrow their governments, similar to Venezuela, like that in Syria, Iraq, and Libya. Diego, do you agree with that assessment?
No, absolutely. I mean, and you can even, there's like, let's call it this kind of cross-pollination between one experience and the other one. I mean, each one enriches and updates the next one. I mean, and actually this, there's a book by Greg Grandin, for example, called Empire's Workshop. Basically, and the central premises of it is all these attempts, all these models that have been played out since the early 20th century in Latin America are the ones that are used afterwards somewhere else, including even dropping bombs for World War I. I think it had to do with how they bombed in Haiti and Dominican Republic in the early years of the 20th century, same with Nicaragua. And also, talking about Syria, when it all started, it was the Contra model. I mean, this weird third force that got involved between the protesters and the government, and suddenly started disappearing and killing people, extrajudicially killing people. That later on, it turned out it was all these Wahhabist factions that were doing this. That's a Contra model. And actually, you had, I forgot his name, Robert Ford, the ambassador for the U.S. there, was number 2 from John Negroponte in Honduras. So it's clearly, it was a contrast back then. So yeah, what I'm saying here is it's clearly connected, and one experience brings to the other. And perhaps the most obvious one, there are two obvious connections here. The first one is, in this Empire toolbox, which is one of them, it's the Noriega experience, for once, which is, it has a different context and a different evolution, but of course, they actually got to arrest the guy inside of Panama after bombing the crap out of Panama. And but the other one, it's even closer to home in time, which is the WMD 2003 Iraq thing. They're just exploiting a figment of imagination. But there is a precedent here, the same as it was in regarding Iraq, that eventually at some point they did have, although they dismantled chemical weapons program, and even before that they had like nuclear plants in '82 that was actually was bombed by Israel back then. But in this case, and I'm picking up what Alan was saying regarding the drug trade, Venezuela during the '80s and the '90s. Actually, there was a major cocaine supply coming from Venezuela, ran by the anti-drugs czar in Venezuela, who was a brigadier general from the National Guard, Guillermo Dávila, Ramon Guillén Dávila, who was actually, at some point, he was indicted because he was caught with trying to send a ton and a half of cocaine after he was already doing it a long time. with the help of the CIA. It was the DEA who caught him afterwards. There's even a 60 Minutes, Max posted the other day on Twitter, Max Blumenthal. We were talking about it before. And it shows precisely what they were doing, what some security personnel in Venezuela was actually doing, collaborating, sending cocaine to the US in the 90s, just like in Nicaragua, just like in Bolivia. So that also stopped. That's the moment, that's the actual origin of El Cartel del Sol in singular back then. It was a name that disappeared suddenly, but it was in 2005 when Venezuela cut ties with the DEA that it reappeared in a Miami Herald piece by an unnamed top diplomat in the country, which is easily to deduce it was William Brownfield, of course. But so there's this, I mean, the Cartel de los Soles tag comes from a CIA creation back in the 90s during, well, while they were funding themselves with cocaine trade and sending cocaine to Florida. Cocaine that was indicted in Venezuela. So you have that element there, and then it, of course, it took a life of itself, a life of its own throughout the years. But that connection, I think it's important. The same with oil, the same, which is far more obvious. I mean, because the Cartel de los Soles things is a narrative element, but also the way that unrestrained oil supply that they had back then, it changed when Venezuela had the sovereign government and started to regulate the oil supply and opening our offer to partners around the world and not an exclusive relationship with the U.S. So this is also part of it and part of the problem. Now, regarding the other element, which is what could happen now, I also share the view of both my friends here, Alan and Leonardo, and you won't, with 4,000 Marines, you're not going to do anything significant, but with 1,200 Aegis missiles, you could. I think that's the main danger here. And also because, like I was saying before, something also didn't add up. The 4,000 Marines could make sense if there was some internal strife going on, or some armed insurgency being successful inside Venezuela, which is not happening. So regardless, at this moment in time where it's September the 10th, it's more about fear-mongering and trying to reach some breaking point in order to see if the government collapses of this or the Venezuelan society rise up or whatever. Now with their in social media, you can see people already wanting to do the Nepal thing, but it's at this point, it's still just there. But it does do some harm economically, of course. This has been one of the best months regarding oil supply and oil sales from Venezuela. And you can't disconnect one thing from the other one. So there's also a rush here in order to not allow Venezuela to even recover even more. Because when you were here, Mnar, in 2021, things were improving already. But things are far better now. I mean, it's not that there are not problems. We have major issues still. And we're still under the sanctions program. But things are better than they were before. So that's also, I think, a reason that they're pushing this. And there's another one. You can think of Marco Rubio now as the most dangerous president in the world, even more dangerous than Netanyahu. And actually one of the most powerful persons in the world as well, because he has a dual, and not a dual, a triple score there. He has his State Department, I mean, he's the State Secretary. He is the National Security Advisor, interim, but he is. And he also is the main interventor of USAID. So he has like three very important power structures that actually deal with this kind of things in a moment that, the world is going kind of bonkers. Think about Nepal. Think about the armed confrontation in Cambodia and Thailand a few weeks ago. Think about all this going on precisely at this moment. And he knows he might be running out of time. He knows he could lose Trump's ear at any given time and lose whatever. So this is his opportunity, and that's why he's pushing so hard.
That's a really interesting analysis about, the world is in just chaos right now. And this is Trump's moment to do what he needs to do in Venezuela. I think a lot of people are curious to know is, why does the United States care so much about overthrowing Venezuela? And I think we answered that in different ways throughout this conversation. And maybe one of the most obvious ones is that the United States and companies like ExxonMobil want access to Venezuela's oil. But another aspect is that Venezuela holds this massive mineral reserve that the military industrial complex wants to get a hold of, the same kind of minerals that are fueling our tech industry, for the same reason why Congo has been the victim of modern day colonialism. And so then we also have, the fact that Venezuela is building trade agreements with countries like Iran, countries like China and Russia, and it's giving them access to the oil and the minerals and not the United States, but also because Venezuela was kind of pushed in a corner, sanctioned, and didn't really have much of a choice other than to create these economic ties. Leonardo, can you expand on those points?
Yeah, I mean, I think we first have to look back to when Venezuela was first sanctioned, and that was 2006 by the Bush administration that imposed a sanction on weapons sales. Up to that point, as Alan and as Diego were saying, up to the 90s and when Chavez was elected, Venezuela was a very close ally of the United States and basically bought almost its entire weapon systems from the United States. So when Bush does that, it forces Venezuela to go to other countries for its military needs. And one of the things about that particular sanction was that it didn't allow any U.S. components, which most NATO countries that deal in weapons use U.S. components in one way or another, forcing Venezuela basically to buy from China, from Russia, and from Iran. So that it's basically the United States kind of shooting itself in the foot and creating these conditions to have some sort of adversary in South America when Venezuela doesn't want to view that relationship with U.S. as necessarily an adversarial one. And when we look at why the United States is going after Venezuela, you mentioned it, right? It's gold, it's oil, it's minerals, it's gold, it's all these resources. Laura Richardson, who was the head of Southern Command, a couple of years ago, she did this really notorious interview in which she basically listed all of the resources that are in South America and said that the United States has to do whatever it can to get access to those minerals and resources. So this is a long-term plan to take control, not just of Venezuela's oil, but its rare earth minerals, its bauxite, its gold, its water, whatever you want. The thing is, when Venezuela renationalized its oil industry under Chavez, it didn't kick out the United States companies, right? Chevron has stayed in Venezuela. Chevron's been in Venezuela for over 100 years, if I'm not mistaken. But Exxon left. And Exxon left because they didn't like the deal, and they sued Venezuela for about $10 billion in these international courts, and they won an award of about $1.5 billion. And since then, Exxon has had painted a target on Venezuela. And what we're seeing now is some of the Exxon's labor comes to fruition because Exxon has heavily invested in Guyana, and Venezuela and Guyana have a border, and they have a border dispute that dates back to colonial times. And now Exxon is using this border dispute to kind of push Venezuela onto a confrontation with the United States. We have to remember that the president of Exxon at one point was Rex Tillerson, and he was invested heavily in Guyana right before he then becomes Trump's first Secretary of State. And then Rex Tillerson, as Secretary of State, is one of the very first ones in the Trump administration to threaten a war on Venezuela, to say that if there's a coup in Venezuela, the United States would welcome it. And so we see all the paper trail that really heads to Exxon trying to foment and trying to push for some sort of conflict with Venezuela. So resources and control of resources is a big part of the story here. But another part of the story, because it's not just oil, it's about geopolitical control. And since Chavez came into power, Venezuela has exercised an independent foreign policy. And that, for the United States, is a huge crime in terms of Latin America, because any country that tries to exercise independence in a very real way becomes under the foot of the U.S. government, whether it's Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia, you name it. And so that kind of explains that it's not just oil, because Cuba and Nicaragua don't have the resources that Venezuela has, and yet they are under very similar pressures. So there's all these factors, but yes, of course, oil and geopolitics are the two main ones.
Absolutely. And I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to end talking about Gaza because, it's a tragedy that's taking place before our eyes. It's being live streamed, a genocide on our smartphones. And when I was in Caracas I couldn't help but notice walking through the streets, graffiti all over the streets of Caracas, calling Netanyahu a baby killer and fists in solidarity with the people of Palestine. And from what I know, Hugo Chavez made Palestine a national cause for the people of Venezuela. Venezuela has been resisting US imperialism on the international stage, not just from, pushing back against sanctions, but standing on the right side of history and standing against US colonial and Israeli colonial projects, including Palestine. And so I want to talk about how these two issues are fundamentally part of the same story. Alan, can you explain that to us?
Oh, yeah, it's all part of the same world system. They're so interconnected. Last year, I was speaking to the Palestinian ambassador in Caracas, and he said that Venezuela was the leader of the world in terms of Palestinian solidarity. And as you said, Mnar, if you go to Venezuela, you can really see this. You can see Palestinian murals everywhere, flags draped out there. There's, as I said, murals of famous Palestinian poets, writers. You'll even see people like Hassan Nasrallah on the walls. And for the longest time, I mean, Hugo Chavez, as you said, made Palestine an issue. This was more than 15 years ago. He condemned Israel as a terrorist state and broke off relations with Israel. And, even at the last national elections, when President Maduro cast his ballot and, in front of all the TV cameras, what did he say? He said, "Long live free Palestine." That's what he decided to say in that, 5-second soundbite where they would be played to the nation and be played all around the world. And on the other side of that, Maria Corina Machado, who was one of the leaders of the opposition in Venezuela, she said that our struggle is Israel's struggle. That's what her message was. So these things are really completely connected in the minds of people all around the world. And you see this in Latin America as well. If you see rallies for right-wing forces, if you watch like a Bolsonaro rally, there's always the US flag and the Israeli flag there. And, in 2019, when the coup against Evo Morales happened, Israel came out and immediately said this is a victory against anti-Semitism in the world. What did he mean by that? I mean, Israel has a considerable impact in Latin America. I mean, it trained right-wing death squads around the region. So much so that it's just become normalized. I mean, the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, he actually did an ad for an Israeli mercenary firm while he was president, and he appeared in that. That's how normalized the sort of Israeli military footprint is in many places in Latin America. So, I mean, yeah, these are all interlinked. We're talking about one part of the global empire here and another place, but ultimately, all oppressed people see themselves in Palestine, and all oppressors see themselves in Israel. In fact, many Latin Americans even see Israel as a model, a white settler colonial state. That's what they want to implant on their countries, because Latin America is very racially diverse. But when we look at socially and on the class basis, the poor are mostly black and the black are mostly poor. And regardless of where you are, there's always a light-skinned elite in these countries. And so, yeah, the struggle against colonialism and empire is the same all around the world, and people in the global south understand that.
One of the best trips and most memorable trips I took was to Venezuela in 2021, and I was extremely angered while I was there. I was inspired by the movement, but I was completely angered by the fact that the United States was sabotaging Venezuela in every way possible and trying to suffocate the people there through sanctions and preventing them from importing very basic parts for their machinery, for example, and preventing life-saving medicine like diabetes medicine for the people in Venezuela that were suffering. But I was also completely in awe at the kindness, the generosity, and the solidarity that people showed with the people of Palestine. I was walking in Caracas with my hijab as a Palestinian, and I was like the only one who looked like that. And everyone was just giving me hugs and, putting their fist up for Palestine. It was really beautiful to see And so it was just something I'll never forget. And so I thank you all for all of the historical context that you provided in helping us understand the situation in Venezuela. But before we go, I just want to say one more time that MintPress is in need of everybody's support who's listening to this and watching this segment. One of our main lines of funding has been cut. And so we did launch a campaign on Indiegogo. And please support us in any way that you can. We are in an emergency fundraising state right now. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me today.